Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Amy Antonucci, a New Hampshire Peace Action Board member, and I'm really glad to welcome you to our Peace and Justice Conversation series online for November 20th, 2023. For over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all. In that spirit of respect, we'd like to start with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work on Nidakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki people. We honor with gratitude the land and the waterways and the people who have been in relationship throughout the generations. I also want to mention that tonight is being co-sponsored by Open Democracy, a group in New Hampshire working to achieve political equality for all, with a government accountable to the people, free from the influence of wealthy special interest groups. So lately, most of our programming has been focused on the current crisis in Palestine and Israel. But tonight we're going to talk about an issue that we all know has been making our work so much harder. As peace activists, we're just so aware of the power that corporate interests have to block our progress in ending militaristic policies. And here to explain that is Greg Coleridge, co-director of Move to Amend, which is organizing to pass the We the People Amendment that would abolish corporate constitutional rights and money as free speech. Greg worked for more than 3 decades with the American Friends Service Committee. He writes and speaks widely, including the book Citizens Over Corporations and the Real Democracy History Calendar. He's been on the board of Common Cause and was a principal with the program on corporations, law, and democracy. We're going to hear from him, and then we'll move to Q&A and discussion. You can go ahead and use the chat right away to, if questions occur to you, and then we'll open it up more for that a little later. But for now, please join me in welcoming Greg.
Well, thank you so much, Amy and Doreen, and to New Hampshire Peace Action for the invitation, and to all of you for taking the time to be here this evening. I do plan to sort of babble at you for a few minutes, and then we can kind of open it up for cussing and discussing about what I've laid out and how it connects to the issues you care about, both locally and from the local to the global, which at AFSC, one of the peace education directors named David Gracie said global and local are all connected inextricably, and they are. And certainly issues of peace and justice and democracy are inextricably connected from the local to the global. All right, so I'm going to share screen here. Try. All right, hopefully everyone can see this. And I'm just going to start with a very brief introduction of Move to Amend. For those of you who may not be aware, it's a coalition of hundreds of organizations and hundreds of thousands of individuals committed to justice in all of its forms, social and economic in particular, ending corporate rule and building a vibrant democracy that's legitimately accountable to the people, not corporate interests. Our basic principles and values, we began on the day of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision back in 2010, has always been these 5: anti-oppression and solidarity organizing, trying to build a coalition focused on building a movement for real democracy, grassroots organizing from the bottom up, dedication to political education to help try to get on the other side of the learning curve, particularly around corporate rule and money as free speech, and the inextricable connection between political and economic independence. Because if you have the one, but you don't have the other, you really are dependent on the powers to be, whether they're economic or political. So both are inextricably connected and necessary. Our goals are to pass, as Amy mentioned, this resolution that we call the We the People Amendment, to make clear that artificial entities, and that's what corporations are, do not have constitutional rights. They have statutory rights, not constitutional. We can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested in wanting to know the difference. And that money is not constitutionally protected free speech. But the second goal, that's even wider and deeper, is to provoke discussion and organizing that goes beyond the We the People Amendment that tries to create authentic democracy, really for the very first time through constitutional renewal, that goes beyond the We the People Amendment. Sensitive here. Here we go. This We the People Amendment, H.R. 54, has 3 sections. The first, radical notions, right? The first being that artificial entities, such as corporations, do not have constitutional rights. People are persons, and a corporation is a person. And second, that money is not free speech. Look, money is property. If money is speech, then those who have the most speech have the most money, have the most speech, which means those of us who don't have money, our voice. Not a real good definition of anything approaching authentic, legitimate democracy. And third, nothing in the amendment shall be construed to abridge the freedom of the press. And the link to the full text of the amendment is there at the bottom, movetoamend.org/amendment. So let's get into a little bit about how we got into the fix that we're in, starting with the original Constitution. Well, not really the original, it's the second. The original Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. But the second Constitution was the one we know of, and in many ways very revolutionary, beginning with the first 3 words of the preamble, We the People. So some very good things about it, some very revolutionary, bottom-up, small d democracy, but on the flip side, some very not so great things about it, including limiting human personhood rights to white male property owners, right? Everybody else was considered to be less a person. 3/5 or women were sort of just beholden to men. Native people, indigenous people weren't persons at all of any fraction. They were considered beasts, as defined in the Declaration of Independence. Look it up. The U.S. Constitution affirmed property rights over human rights, and that as a result, most of U.S. history and most of people coming together to form social movements to try to gain rights that should have happened and should have existed all along, but did not, had to happen with people organizing themselves to drive themselves into the Constitution again, where they should have been from day one. However, a few things, again, very positively about the Constitution has to do with corporate entities. Corporate entities are not in any way, shape, or form mentioned in the Constitution. They have no legal foundation. The revolution was in part a revolution against what were called crown corporate entities, things like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Baltimore Company, the Maryland Company. These were entities created by the king to give a certain number of people sort of the protection of being sued, like of forming. But that corporation was beholden to the king, to the sovereign. They were created and defined. So that was what the revolution was. It was not just a revolution against the king. It was not just a revolution against the king's armies. It was a revolution against the king's corporate entities. These democratic or these entities that were not democratic to begin with were, if you will, constitutionalized. And so corporations were created and defined post-revolution by we the people and public officials, mostly at the state level via charters or licenses. They were granted or revoked, just as licenses are given to individual human beings if they are professionals and want to conduct business. A lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, a architect. There are hundreds of professional people in my state of Ohio, and no doubt in your state of New Hampshire or anywhere else people may be, who to do business have to get a license to do business. That is what a corporate charter was, and it was intended to be a democratic instrument to control, to make sure that corporate entities did what they were told to do, to provide useful goods and services, to make sure that they followed the law and that they didn't become too powerful and too independent from those entities that granted a license or a charter. This was the intention, the norm, the default, and along the way, political money had no rights. So again, was the means that state legislatures used to define, to authorize what companies could or could not do. And charters were very restrictive and very specific. And so many charters that were for a limited period of time, 10, 20, sometimes as long as 30 years, limited the amount of land ownership, the amount of capitalization or total investment of owners, limited the charter to a specific purpose. So if the purpose was, I don't know, to build a roadway, they couldn't go into banking. Or if there, was charter said you're supposed to build a table, you couldn't build chairs unless it was defined in the charter. And corporations, besides not being permitted to do anything beyond what was defined in the charter, they couldn't even engage in political activities of any kind, nor even be involved in charitable purposes. The fear was that if they get involved in charities, the recipients of those charitable donations or contributions would become beholden or dependent on those corporate entities. And that is not what the state legislature, what we the people wanted to create. So when corporate entities did go beyond the charter, that was stated by the terms of the charter, then those charters or those licenses were revoked, and those companies were dissolved. And they were done by either the state legislature or the state courts. And here are a couple of examples of that. Rhode Island, for example, one of many states, 19 in fact, during the middle part of the 19th century, that when companies on their own decided to alter or do something that was not defined in the charter, that charter was revoked. And so in this example, they declared, the state of Rhode Island legislature, that, quote, the charter or acts of association of any corporation hereafter created may not be amenable or repealed at the will of, may be amenable or repealed at the will of the General Assembly. And that happened routinely. And a good example of that is in the state of New York in 1890. And I pull this out simply because I love the spirit as well as the actual specific verbiage of the text of this decision of the state Supreme Court, where it said, in part, the judgment sought against the defendant is one of corporate death. And then it goes on, the life of a corporation is indeed less than that of the humblest citizen. So the default, the culture, the mindset of the was that we the people and those we elect, state legislature, they were in charge. They were the authorizer. They were the definer. They were the ones that decided what companies could and could not do. They were the power, and corporate entities were the subordinates. There wasn't any sense of equality here. There wasn't certainly any sense of superiority, but subordination. Companies could only do what the charter permitted them to do. There were no rights, only privileges. An important distinction. No constitutional rights, no even statutory rights by law, only privileges. They were granted by the state, usually one charter, one corporate entity at a time. So companies didn't like all this democratic muscle flexing at all. And so as a result, they sought to escape democratic control. And they did that in one of four ways. Either they ran away from the one state where they were chartered to another, where the laws were less onerous. And at the time, early on, it was New Jersey, until Delaware, out New Jersey, New Jersey. Second, they moved from the state level to the federal level. The idea being that at the states, you as a citizen had at least some kind of contact to try to make those state officials accountable. Federal people, they were much further removed in Washington, D.C., much harder to control. And so for corporate entities, much easier for them to control and influence federal officials than state. Third, corporate entities escaped democratic control from the legislative arena to this new regulatory arena. And so we tend to think today, do we not, that, oh, regulatory agencies exist on our behalf, but they really don't for the most part. All they do is sort of regulate harms. And regulatory organizations, agencies that were early on were done at the behest and with the support, including the very first regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission, with the blessing of the railroad corporations. Far better to be regulated than to be dissolved. Far better to be regulated than to be, for example, publicly controlled and publicly owned, which was during that period of US history very popular, to take public ownership of things like public utilities. And finally, the last way was to run away from the legislative arena to the judicial arena, the courts, and thus the court granted constitutional rights. And so if you think about it, it's sort of the equivalent of Frankenstein, creating the global, if you will, and national and even local and state corporate entity that became at first, sort of akin and beholden to the creator, Frankenstein, but at times and over time becomes more powerful and kills the creator. And that is what has become today of the modern corporation. Become larger in life, if you will, and more powerful than even we citizens. And think about it, the other metaphor is when we, the people, are in charge and those we elect define corporations, they are and we are akin to being sort of players on the field, right? In the case here of baseball, we're pitchers, batters, fielders. We're in the game. We're playing. We're competing. We're authorizing. We're having a role in the shape of the outcome. But when you move decision-making from the legislative arena to the judicial arena, now we move from being on the field to in the stands. We're no longer a player. We're in the stands. We can boo, we can hiss as the court comes out with a decision that we hate or we like. The difference, though, is we are booing and hissing. We are not on the field. We are not players. We're merely spectators. We no longer have the power to decide. We no longer are sovereign. We no longer are independent. We no longer are self-governing, self-determining. We no longer have the right to decide what's going on in our families and our communities with Mother Earth in trying to create a livable world. And that has been the power, basically, in the result of corporate entities. Corporate entities have hijacked the US Constitution. And by hijacking, we're talking about taking something that was originally intended and perverting it, beginning with the 14th Amendment, where corporate entities took the equal protection and due process clauses of this amendment that was designed, intended to apply exclusively to freed slaves, to say, guess what? It now applies to us, to themselves. And so it began with this Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, where they sort of perverted it. There's sort of a backstory to it. We can get into it in discussion if you're interested, but it sort of went downhill from there, in which following this decision, as Justice Hugo Black said, for the first 50 years after its adoption in 1886, less than 0.5% of the decisions by the Supreme Court were used to define and to protect the Negro race. More than 50% asked that its benefits be extended to business corporations. So it was business corporations that were able to use, more like abuse, the 14th Amendment for their own benefit rather than freed slaves. That was the original intent and the original constituency of the 14th Amendment. But it continued downhill from there, in which corporate entities hijacked other Supreme Court decisions or that were intended exclusively for human beings. And in many cases, actually the original part or part of the original Bill of Rights. And that includes the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, as well as the Fourth Amendment. So Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights that were intended to apply to protect the inspections of private property of individuals. Guess what? It now became applied to corporate entities, to where it limited the ability to inspect corporate property. to ensure compliance of health, safety, and welfare. Corporate Fifth Amendment takings rights became a way for corporate entities to limit the abilities to protect private property from extraction and promote environmental pollution. And this is incredibly important today, and we'll get into it later, when we're trying to keep things like oil and gas and other entities that are destroying the climate in the ground. That is something that will become much more difficult if that becomes much more serious of a threat down the chain, with corporate entities being able to use the Fifth Amendment as a defense. Corporations win the First Amendment political free speech rights. That limits the ability to limit money in elections, which corporations have used, as well as well-to-do individuals. This becomes a form of legalized bribery that has empowered corporations to take your pick, buy, rent, lease, or retain public officials. And lastly, corporations have won the First Amendment right not to speak, and that's limited the ability to demand food, labeling, warning of potential cancer-causing information, and much others. All of these rights need to be said were granted prior to the Citizens United Supreme Court decision of 2010. So just to sort of some corporate constitutional rights, or sometimes known as personhood, were not originally intended, not inevitable, not irreversible. It's not like the tides, not like the sun coming up in the morning and setting in the evening. Wasn't created, these constitutional rights, by any past law or regulation passed by any elected official of any political party in any state, in any locality, in any decade, by any group or by any citizen initiative at any time. Rather, they were consciously and planned and deliberate efforts by corporate attorneys and activist judges. And what has been consciously and deliberately done, guess what? We have moved to amend, and others believe can be consciously and deliberately undone. And so, this is real sensitive here. Here we go. So we believe that the We the People Amendment is just essential for many of the individual issues people care about, from peace, the Green New Deal, having Medicare for all, environmental policies, because all the issues we care about have been in one way, shape, or form hijacked or perverted, corporatized, or privatized by corporate entities. And so it's not simply, an economic crisis we're dealing with, or environmental crisis, or foreign policy crisis, but at root, a constitutional and or democracy crisis. And this leads us to sort of focusing on issues of various corporate sectors and the power of them. And certainly we could have a debate that could go for quite a long time related to these particular sectors. Is it the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate, the military, technology, sick care? Again, corporate power is through each of these sectors. We're going to focus on the military one in particular, and really the power of the military and militarism is really centered in three different arenas. And what makes the power of the military sector and militarism so unique is sort of the cultural sector. It's not really what we're going to directly talk about related to corporate constitutional rights in the political sector, but it's important to understand because all of these are inextricably connected. And by the cultural sector and the power of the cultural sector, we mean things that we're all familiar with. Those of us who are working, and those of you in particular, working on peace and nonviolence, understand very well issues of patriotism and nationalism are used to foment and promote, right, wars and occupation, nationalism, the whole fear of national security and secrecy that certainly is fed by racism and the other of people of color in this country and abroad. This whole notion and culture of, manifest destiny. We are people who are destined to rule the world and to be policemen of the world. And certainly the whole cultural thing of glorifying the military and violence in general, wars, guns. Well, my God, it even goes into professional sports and football, does it not? When football is described in very violent and militaristic ways. And the idea of might makes right. All of these are so central to the sort of cultural sense of militarism in the military that has existed for decades, if not for centuries. but has been worse over the last several decades. The economic power of militarism in the military certainly is part of what is maybe the sole form of national industrial policy in this country. The only thing that the government really does invest heavily in is the military, where we give basically incredible amounts of money to build weapons to a small number of very large corporations, and that these very large corporations hire people that pay, very good, well-paying jobs. They're union jobs, and that communities depend on these union jobs as other companies have moved away to other states or overseas. And so the taxes and the income of communities have become very dependent on those military jobs. And trade, about the only thing that we have a positive trade deal with is we sell weapons, and we're very profitable as a country in selling weapons. And of course, the economic power of the military, it takes the form of the decentralization of contracts with military companies, making sure that when they get a contract for a weapon system, they try to divide it up into as many different congressional districts, pieces of doing that as possible, so that that congressional representative, so that those communities, so that those individuals, so that those employees of those companies become then advocates for those contracts, whether those weapons are needed or not. The privatization and corporatization of the military certainly is a piece of it. And then, of course, the support of international capital and capitalism. There are so many companies, are there not, that depend on sort of being overseas and taking advantage of cheap labor or of anti-democratic governments to sort of plunder labor, plunder people, extract resources, extract minerals, extract, the natural resources. And so it's plundering people, it's plundering the planet. And so it's very important for those transnational corporations, US-based, to maintain their profits by making sure that they're able to exist in an environment where maybe they're not very popular doing what they're doing. So they need the US Army, the US Air Force, the US Navy, the CIA, and the National Reconnaissance Information, and all the other military apparatuses and security agencies to protect them in the same way that early in this country's history, forts were out there to protect expansionist communities. And so finally, we get here, I'll just quickly go over how economic power in the military is, war is good for business. And so I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, so we can save this, but here are all the ways, that basically throughout history, and certainly up to the present, that war is good for business and makes sure and becomes then a reason for militaristic corporations to sort of be a part of promoting constant and perpetual war and conflict, so that they can continue to feed that insecurity, to feed that fear, to feed the armies and the navies and the bombs and the weapons that are used by both sides sometimes. And the US has in the past supplied military weaponry to both sides and strategy to both sides and the like. And as Smedley Butler talked about, war being a racket. This is the name of a pamphlet and a book. He talks about, he was a muscle man for big business. In short, I was a racketeer and a gangster for capitalism. This is a quote, one of my favorites, of Bancroft on one of the entrances of the US Commerce Building, that says, "Commerce defies every wind, outrides every tempest, and invades every zone." And that is sort of, again, sort of the whole notion of our economic system at large, to maintain our profit margin for US-based transnational corporations. We absolutely must continue to go abroad and plunder people and the planet. So all of this leads to, finally, the political power of militarism in the military. Again, there's the community support that comes from local public officials, unions, and charitable organizations, but it also comes from the lobbying and political investments that are derived from corporate First Amendment free speech rights. So corporations have won the right to give as much money as they pretty much so desire to public officials to convince them to continue to support the military. And it's become so ridiculous that many times Congress has passed Pentagon budgets that's more than what the military has even asked for, or that the president has asked for. And so political donations in the top 20 in the year 2022, political donations of the top 5 military contractors that are listed there, 33.5 million. Lobbying was 128 million. But and US-based corporations, transnational corporations, it's not only the military contractors that are using the political donations and the lobbying to sort of corrupt the political process and corrupt public officials, Congress people in particular, but it's all of these US-based transnational corporations that benefit from globalization. And this is no doubt led by the energy corporations, right? The Exxon Mobils and the other energy companies that are extracting resources in other countries and need the military to protect them, to ensure that they're continuing to do that. So it's no accident why we have so many military bases in places like the Middle East, where there is so much extraction going on. And so these energy corporations have these other constitutional rights, the right not to speak, that has prevented us, we the people and the public, from sort of getting at some of their documents internal that have shown that they knew about the burning of fossil fuels being destructive of the climate for decades. And they have been threatening to use the Fifth Amendment, these energy corporations, the takings rights, to say that if you try to move on us and try to prevent us from continuing to mine oil and gas or coal or anything else, then we will sue you for lost future profits that could amount in the trillions of dollars. So we basically end here by just saying, are we the people amendment, this effort to support ending corporate personhood and money of speech, has garnered nearly 500,000 individuals, over 750 organizations, 700 community resolutions in 8 states, including 54 now New England town meetings, a proposed state resolution that is in the offing. We can get into that. One of your state representatives is talking about introducing something in the state house. 73 co-sponsors right now of the HJR 54 We the People Amendment. But curiously and coincidentally, they do not include your 2 representatives, Annie Custer and Chris Pappas. Here's a list of all the social and democracy movements that have occurred basically throughout history. So when people talk about, man, trying to pass a resolution or a constitutional amendment is hard, yes, it's hard. It's damn hard. But it's happened before. And given sort of the direction we're headed in and the need for the kind of change that needs to happen in terms of the degree and the magnitude to deal with the fundamental lack of democracy, certainly a democratic amendment led by a democratic movement is so necessary. Just to end things here, what people can do is sign our motion to amend. I'll put in the chat how you can do that. You can organizationally endorse our effort and add to the 750 organizations that endorse this effort, support the state effort to pass your state resolution, and help us to, I know you're focused now and should be on stopping the violence in Israel and Gaza, but hopefully in the short term, when that ends and things maybe quiet down a little bit, hopefully sooner rather than later, then you can help us try to get your reps to co-sponsor HJR 54. And I just basically end with this quote by George Bernard Shaw. And here's the New England, or in fact, more specifically, New Hampshire link. The Devil's Disciple was a play first performed in 1897 in New Hampshire. It's set in New Hampshire anyway during the American Revolution. And he says the possibilities are numerous once we decide to act and not react. And basically the takeaway there is it's so important that as we work as activists, not only to react, respond, and resist, which is absolutely essential to do, that we leave at least some time and effort and resources set aside to not just respond, but to propose, not just oppose, not just react, but to initiate action for things that are going to create power and change the fundamental democratic rules of the game. So I end it there.
Thank you, Greg. I'm gonna change, actually, just if anyone has a question, you can use the chat or raise your hand. Try to do the, the one through reactions. It's much easier for me to see. But we're open for your questions now and your thoughts, I guess. I guess I will start it off. No, Marcia has something. Go ahead, Oh, hold on. You should be able to unmute now. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hi, Greg. That was wonderful. And I'm just wondering, how do you go about? It seems like a daunting task to change the mindset, the national mindset of people to vote for values that support move to amend, as opposed to what we've seen. For instance, there's like to me, there's such a disconnect. East Palestine, Ohio, when they went through the railroad derailment, were so concerned and are still so concerned about the damage to the community, and their water is being, I think, sent underground to wells in Coshocton, and the people are very upset, and rightly so, with Norfolk Southern. But on the other hand, they voted not to be they voted for Trump in Coshocton. I mean, overwhelmingly supported Trump. So how it just seems so daunting. It seems like the right thing to do, but there's such a disconnect between the values that it seems they hold dear in their heart, as opposed to who they're voting for when they, go to the ballot box. How do you start this ball rolling?
Yeah, well, I think the word you bring up, disconnect, is a good one. And I guess a lot of it depends on what disconnect one's referring to, because when it comes to these issues, there is no question of disconnect between the policies that those we elect or are chosen to represent us, that oftentimes those same individuals are being influenced, are they not, by their big donors more than the voters. But there's a disconnect between the policies they create or don't create and what people want on issue after issue. People do want clean environment. They do want, a higher minimum wage. They do want sort of, healthcare that is affordable. They do want, clean energy. They do want sort of education that is system-wide and affordable. And if you're a student, don't want to, they want public education that's affordable, if not free, if it's at a high school or a lower level. So the real disconnect is between that and the kind of policies that we have or don't have, because the policies we have are the corporatization or privatization of all of those things. And when it comes to, the We the People Amendment, all of these communities that have passed resolutions, only in one instance was there an effort where a ballot measure got on the ballot that was defeated, calling for this. And that was only because the language was so vague and generalized. But in community after community, in state after state, when citizens pass or citizens circulate resolutions to get on the ballot, citizen-driven resolutions, it has passed not only in very, quote unquote, liberal communities, but in more, quote unquote, conservative communities, whether it's at a local level or even a state level. And many communities that pass these resolutions have voted for, Republicans 2-1, but at the same time pass the We the People Amendment calling on Congress. So the real disconnect is between what people want, which is justice and peace and a livable world, and the kind of policies that are just the opposite.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Jean is up next. Go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, thanks. This great discussion so far. I guess there's so many things to be said. I guess my question is one of empire. all empires throughout history have come and gone. The Romans, the British, the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch. Um, the American empire seems to be in its death throes, shall we say. One of the ways empires end is through overextending themselves militarily. We can see that with the Biden administration's request for billions and billions of dollars. And now it's, the failed war in Ukraine, and now Israel, $14 billion on top of the approximately $4 billion we just give Israel every year, a blank check. It seems like America and Israel are basically isolating themselves from the rest of the world, especially through Israel's over-the-top, insane genocidal reactions to what I would say as a prison breakout by Hamas on October 7th. Not condoning any violence whatsoever here. But how do you see the empire ending here? Because I believe, with the rise of the BRICS nations and China, and more people, the entire GDP of the BRICS nations now outpaces that of the G7 globally. There's a lot of major tectonic shifts happening within the geopolitical spectrum right now. So where do you see the American empire, say by the year 2030? I can't see it has how it is going to be, as powerful as it is today or once was.
Well, again, you bring up a good word that I think is very descriptive of the times we're in and the reality we're in, and that is empire. The U.S. Does. This is an empire that we are in, and like all empires, they really think of. I mean, I think the image that comes to mind is a donut. That of empires just sort of expand and forever trying to reach, but at some point it's empty in the middle, and it sort of falls apart from within. Now, I think there are some external threats to it, not simply other nations that are pushing back, but there are ecological, physical limits to it that we are coming rapidly up to in terms of return on investment of energy, in trying to, continue to feed through energy the continual growth. Certainly the problem associated with all empires is continuing to want to expand and grow. But over the last couple hundred years, with the rise of capitalism, it's growthism, with this perpetual growth and growth that's exponential, which do the math, you just can't keep up with, and it just requires just this continual mammoth exploration for resources to feed it, to make sure it doesn't implode, and it just physically can't do it. Energy-wise can't do it, ecologically can't do it. So I think there'll be a combination of reaching an external limit of not being able to feed the empire and the resources and the growth that is trying to maintain the standard of living in this country. But at the same time, the decline internally, that's the whole of the donut, with the infrastructure internally. So the physical infrastructure, but also the social and the moral decay, with people just becoming, to a certain extent, many times, either paralyzed or distracted with all the entertainment and stuff about what is really going on in the rest of the world. And so that is sort of a moral collapse, an ethical collapse on top of the physical infrastructure collapse to maintain a quote unquote civilization. So I think that the pressures are coming from both directions.
Okay. Let Jean finish up, and then I'll go to you, Tony.
I could talk to Craig all night, actually. I don't want to hog the spotlight here, so give other people
Okay.
say
Okay.
something.
Well, then we'll go to Tony next.
Thank you. Greg, I agree with everything you said, although I have to say when you say everything, and I was aware of a lot of it, but not everything, but when you say all that and put it together, it's very scary. And I got to believe the great majority of Americans have no idea what's going on or why. And if they did, they would think, well, it doesn't really affect me. And they vote for candidates who, don't support policies for people, but rather policies for big business. And my understanding is the kinds of candidates that support the kinds of reforms you're talking about tend to be Democrats, and very few Republicans ever support those kinds of things. Is that true? Could you comment on that, and including like what are the prospects for passing this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Without, unless Democrats are able to, have more control over Congress, but of course they still don't have control over the courts.
Yeah, that one slide I showed of the social movements and democracy efforts throughout history have, for the most part, always, they have one thing in common, I think, and that is that to bring about the kind of changes in, constitutional amendments or fundamental legislative changes have always involved two tracks. One is people who are organizing the one track on that legal change or that constitutional change. The other is people who are working on the cultural dimension, working on changing what is considered to be normal, what is considered to be acceptable, what is considered to be inevitable. Because right now, what's considered to be inevitable, which in a sense almost is the fact that we are becoming ever more controlled by the very few, and that this is, no way out. And to some extent, that is true. But on the other hand, damn it, no, it isn't true. What's going on and what is going on, again, is not like the tides. It's not like the earth circling the sun. It's intentional, it's deliberate, and it can be undone, but it requires a movement, and a movement unlike we have ever seen before. A movement that is sort of not just sort of, dealing with individual issues that I think is sort of, when you think of individual issues, that sort of vertical, right? They sort of operate this way. We need a horizontal movement. That whatever issue you're concerned about, whatever it is, it's really going to be damn difficult to get that way unless we have sort of a fundamental reshifting of the rules of the game that are more democratic, more inclusive, and the like. And so that's the challenge. The title of this is, it's the subtitle of this program is "It's Up to Us." It's not going to be the politicians that are going to save us ultimately, the Democrats, Republicans, Independents, because quite honestly, half the Democrats are like corporate Dems right now because the system is that way. And so the only way we're going to focus on this is we've got to really work at changing the culture. And when you change the culture, and then, what goes along with it is you get people to endorse it. You do all the things that, you're doing in the peace movement. Those of you who are working in New Hampshire, you try to get others to endorse, you try to pass resolutions, you try to get significant people to come out and take positions, you submit op-eds, you do all of those things that are trying to change the mindset to say, what is going on today can be changed, and we can be part of that change. So I think that's the challenge for us going forward, is to create that democratic culture that is going to be a stepping stone to create the democratic movement that is going to bring about this change. Because the truth of the matter is, these crises that we are facing, it ain't a single crisis. We're not just facing an ecological crisis or an economic crisis or a political crisis. It's all of them. And so the solution to what we're dealing with has got to be proportionate and in scale to the magnitude of what we're dealing with. And I think when you present that to people, they understand that we just can't Mickey Mouse this, solution. We got to deal with something that is proportionate and has to be ratcheted up to the scale. And I think a lot of people are thinking that way, particularly young people. It's like, we can't monkey around. with Mickey Mouse minor reforms. We need to transform, not just to reform.
Yes.
If I could follow up just very quickly. So to create this necessary movement, and I agree, we need that kind of movement, it's going to require some people or organizations to lead it. And it seems to me, organizations like yours, if you get together with similar organizations with the same goal, you could help create that kind of movement. Because like the rest of us, how could we do that? You really need some critical mass of people and resources. I would love one day if as many organizations as possible got together, united people, supporters, and said, we're going to take these actions together, whether it's a boycott or whatever kind of action, and we're going to have an impact. Because I don't know who else could do it.
I agree.
Let me quickly say I know you're not all from New Hampshire, but New Hampshire has a number of organizations such as Open Democracy that do work on this and related reforms and are connected with Greg. And some of us joined Greg this spring for some lobbying on this issue at our congressional reps offices. So there is some amount of that movement building and organization happening. So stay connected with us, and we'll bring more folks in. I mean, we're not going to get to all the questions. Let me ask this, Greg. After we officially end, will you stay around a little bit longer for some more?
Oh, sure.
Okay. So don't worry, we'll get around to folks. But Jean, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I already spoke, so I'll try to be brief, let other people talk. But this may sound a little weird, but if there's one silver lining to the Israeli government's insane, over-the-top genocidal reaction to the events on October 7th, is there has been numerous worldwide protests with thousands and thousands of people. 300,000 on November 4th, supposedly in Washington, D.C. I've only been to one rally in Worcester, a few hundred people when just after it happened. But Turkey, Erdogan was talking to like 1 million people. It's just like, if there's one good thing that's happening out of this, is the recognition of all these things that Greg has talked about, and everything he said, I totally agree with. So I just wanted to mention that, and hopefully, it will lead to more like-minded organizations working together to form this bigger movement, which we can all be a part of. That's just a comment I wanted to make. Thanks.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so
Go
true.
ahead, Greg.
Now, just going to say, very true.
So I actually need to wrap up the hour. We'll stay on after that if folks want to have a little more conversation with Greg. But we'd like to officially end on time. And I have a few things to let you know about. Some of this will go in the chat, but we want you to know that we have a lot of events coming up. Some of them I'll tell you about tonight. Some of them we don't actually have on the calendar yet. We are in the process of planning vigils and action nights and all sorts of things around the current crises in the world. So stay in touch with us at nhpeaceaction.org. You can also look us up on Facebook to learn more about what we're working on and what programming we have coming up. And again, here's a taste. If you're in our area, please join us for a Ceasefire Now Interfaith Vigil for Peace tomorrow, Tuesday, November 21st. It'll start at noon for about 45 minutes. It's in front of Congressman Chris Pappas's office, excuse me, at 660 Central Ave in Dover. This is going to be a solemn vigil by AFSC New Hampshire Peace Action, and the Community Church of Durham. The message is a call for an immediate ceasefire, an end to the Israeli bombardment and blockade of Gaza, and an end to U.S. military aid to Israel. We'd love to have you, and we expect to continue to both have some lobbying efforts and this sort of vigiling in an effort to, this is one of those, I don't know if anyone read the Huffington Post article about the staff in DC and their complete bafflement at how little their representatives are listening to the calls and the people. So our next online peace and justice conversation is on Monday, December 4th, 7 p.m. on Zoom. We will welcome former diplomat and Colonel Ann Wright to talk about how wars end, including what conditions lead to ceasefires and how we can help bring those about. Monday, December 18th, 7 p.m., Sarah Freeman Wolpert from the Friends Committee on National Legislation will be here talking about their organizing across the country, including our New Hampshire advocacy team, and also their current work calling for a ceasefire around the Israel-Palestine issue. So keep an eye on our calendar because there will be more, again, online action nights, in-person visibilities, and some non-Monday night programs in the next few weeks as we continue to pour as much as we can into this call for a ceasefire. This series is free and open to everyone. That said, it means a lot to us to have your support. And you can donate at nhpeaceaction.org/donate. So let's give a very visible thank you to Greg as we let Doreen shut down the live stream. But as I said, if you have the time to stay for a few more minutes, those of you who didn't get to ask your questions will